Good morning. My name is Dr. Kat Robison. I am a lecturer in American Studies at the United States Study Center. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to the elders past and present. The United States Studies Center at the University of Sydney is an independent research institute dedicated to rigorous analysis of American foreign policy, economics, technology, politics, and culture. Its mission is to deepen Australia's understanding of the United States and to provide insights that inform the Australia-US alliance. As part of our work, we often bring senior US experts to Australia. These visits provide an Australian audience with direct insights into current US policy thinking and strategic priorities. At the same time, they enrich national debates by offering informed perspectives on the shared challenges and opportunities facing both countries. Today, we are very fortunate to have with us Ms. Audrey Schaefer. Audrey is an internationally recognized expert in space policy, currently serving as the Vice President of Strategy and Policy at Slingshot Aerospace and a non-resident senior associate with the Aerospace Security Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She previously served in the U.S. government for over 15 years, holding positions in the Executive Office of the President, the Department of Defense, the Department of State, and NASA. Schaefer led the US delegation that negotiated the UN guidelines for space sustainability, and from 2021 to 2023 served as the director for space policy on the National Security Council of the Biden-Harris administration. Audrey, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you, Kat. It's lovely to be here.
So we're here to discuss the challenges that are facing space sustainability. Before we sort of jump into the questions, I just want to give you a chance to talk a little bit about the topic.
Yeah, thank you, Kat. I mean, this is a topic that's really near and dear to my heart that I've spent quite a bit of time over the course of my career working on. So I'm really thrilled to be able to have the opportunity to talk about it today. I just want to start by, going through some of the many ways in which we are all very dependent on space for our everyday lives. We touch space in more ways than I think most people realize. The most visible example of how we all use space is just the GPS. The signal on all of our phones is powered by satellites, US satellites, in fact, that provide precision, timing, and navigation for everything from navigating, to a friend's house to global shipping, air transport, and logistics. That same timing signal is also integral to our financial markets and helps time the transaction for everything from stock purchases to gas at the pump. And of course, connectivity is today, especially in the 21st century, really enabled by space. Long-haul communications into really remote areas where there isn't terrestrial infrastructure like fiber. Satellite provides connectivity to people in places where they wouldn't otherwise have it. And so, we care about space sustainability, not just because we want to keep space, free of orbital debris, but we care about space sustainability because of the benefits that we derive from our use of space. If we allow space to become too congested or too, mucked up with a bunch of junk, then the satellites that you and I use every day and that our economies are dependent on and our militaries are dependent on would be at risk. And those services, therefore, would be at risk as well.
It's very interesting, and you have a lot of deep expertise in this area. Could you talk a little bit to sort of set us up? What are the international frameworks, such as the Outer Space Treaty, that are regulating and this area, and how could those be strengthened or used to better face the challenges?
Yeah, absolutely, Kat. I mean, there is an international legal framework that's related to space activities. As you mentioned, the foundational treaty is called the Outer Space Treaty, and it's from 1967. So it really has stood the test of time. But it is a very general treaty. It kind of is at the principles level, if you will. Things like space, is for the common good of all mankind, and countries have the authority and the responsibility to supervise their national space actors. What it doesn't do is really go into kind of the nitty-gritty details of how we would maintain space sustainability, or really in any way what the specific concrete rules of behavior should be in outer space. So recognizing that over the last almost 20 years now, the international community has focused on developing voluntary guidelines, standards, and norms to address space sustainability challenges. There are two really great examples of really seminal work that contribute to this area. The first is the United Nations Space Debris Mitigation Guidelines, which came into effect in the early 2000s and provide guidance on how spacecraft operators, satellite operators, should both design their satellites and then operate them in space in a way that minimizes the creation of space debris. Now, of course, those guidelines are voluntary at the international level, but many countries have created domestic regulations to then apply those rules for their national space activities. The second set of international guidelines, which you mentioned in my bio, are the United Nations Guidelines on Space Sustainability. And those came into effect just a couple of years ago. Those are also voluntary guidelines, but they're much more expansive than the space debris mitigation guidelines. They do cover activities such as how to avoid collisions in space, how to communicate with other satellite operators so that if you have an incident, you can work collaboratively to respond to it. But they also talk about how to do space activities more sustainably, sort of in general, things like international cooperation, smart regulations, and actually looking at the impacts of space weather, which is a whole nother topic of how that affects operations in space. And so we now have, two fairly rich sets of international norms and standards. And the challenge, I think, is really taking those international guidelines, which I mentioned are voluntary, and really putting them into effect at the national level.
Thanks, Audrey. That's a really fantastic overview. Before we get into some of the more nitty-gritty, could you just talk generally about what we mean when we talk about space sustainability?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, Kat. The way I like to think about it is preserving our ability to use space for current and future generations. Space, when you launch something into space, it takes a long time, like to re-enter. I mean, that's a highly generalized statement, right? Because it really depends on the orbit that you launch it in, what altitude it's at. So a satellite that's launched, fairly low, a couple hundred kilometers above the Earth's surface, might naturally re-enter in 10 or 15 years. But a satellite that's launched into geostationary orbit, which is an orbit that's 20,000 miles above the surface of the Earth, is never going to return to Earth on its own natural orbital dynamics. And so we need to make sure that as we put more and more satellites up into space, we're also cognizant that we're not just protecting those satellites in their current state, but we're actually protecting the use of space for our children and for future generations.
It's so important. And I think later when we do Q&A, we've had a question about that. So we'll get into that as well. So Audrey, I want to come back to you touched on it briefly, but what are those challenges that public and private actors have there navigating the congestion that's in space?
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's really I'd say two main ones that are challenging space sustainability right now. The first is just the growth in orbital debris. So this is either satellites that have ended their useful life and are sort of flying around, uncontrolled, or pieces of satellites, essentially, that are caused when satellites break up, either intentionally or unintentionally, and are just also sort of floating around there. That's the first challenge. And there are a couple of different ways that the international community is focused on addressing those. One I already talked about a bit, which is those guidelines for how you design and operate your missions to really reduce the likelihood that that debris gets created in the first place. The second way is really looking at cleaning up the debris. And this is an area that's fairly new in the last couple of years, but I think is starting to gain quite a bit of traction of how do we remove from orbit, essentially the large satellites or rocket bodies which are dead and either bring them back to Earth or burn them up or even send them out further so that they don't create that hazard to space navigation. The second major challenge that we deal with space sustainability is potential collisions between active satellites. So two satellites that are still performing a mission, providing services, we don't want those satellites to run into one another. And, look, space is really big, but not all orbits around the Earth are really created equal. There are some orbits that are more useful for certain applications than others. And like a great example is when you have a satellite that's taking pictures of the Earth, like remote sensing from space. A really useful orbit to be in is what's called a polar orbit, which means it goes around the Earth kind of in this direction, as opposed to what we usually think of going around the Earth in that direction. And the reason it's really useful is because you can design your orbit so that you actually see the same place on the Earth at the same time every single day. So the same sun conditions, which allows you to do really interesting change detection. So anyway, the reason that's important is because that orbit suddenly is becoming more crowded because it's very useful for a particular application. And so we need to make sure that we are creating both the understanding of where those objects are and then the doing the analysis to predict any collisions that could happen between objects, and then creating the communication pathways and the protocols for satellite operators to work together to avoid any potential collisions that we might predict.
That's really excellent information, Audrey. And it occurs to me that it might be useful to just talk a little bit about how we monitor that in space situational awareness.
Mhm. Absolutely, Kat. And this is something, of course, that's very near and dear to my heart. The company that I work for, called Slingshot Aerospace, we have a global network of ground-based telescopes that we use to do exactly that. There are a number of different countries and companies that have capabilities along these lines. There are both ground-based sensors like telescopes and radars that are used to track objects in space, as well as increasingly satellites themselves that are actually looking at other satellites and tracking their orbits. Now, there are a growing number of objects in space right now, and they pass over all sort of corners of the globe. So when you think about how you need to do space situational awareness, which is that monitoring function, you can't just have, one sensor here or one sensor here. You really need to have a global network of sensors at, diverse geographies in order to not only detect where the objects are, but, continually track them on a regular basis. And so this is where, international collaboration on space situational awareness becomes really important. And countries have started to share the data that they collect so that we have, better awareness for everyone. And certainly there's a developing market with companies like mine to actually sell data to augment those government systems and make sure that operators have the best possible awareness of where their satellites are.
I think this leads very nicely, Audrey, into my next question, which is how does the space sustainability and even space situational awareness, how's that integrated into the national security debate?
Yeah, great question, Kat. I mean, we've spent most of the discussion thus far really talking about kind of just the sustainability aspects, but really, space situational awareness and understanding where objects in space also has a security dimension to it. We want to understand where other countries' satellites in space are, what they're doing, if what they're doing is consistent with international behavioral norms, and international laws and standards. And so, with the exact same, sensors and other analytic capability that we use to monitor, space traffic for safety purposes, we also can monitor that same space traffic for space security, essentially, tracking, satellites of potential competitors, perhaps, but also monitoring our own assets to make
Mm.
sure that they remain safe and secure.
And who would you say is leading the way in terms of space sustainability and security, especially in the areas you've just touched on, Audrey?
Yeah, I think there are a few countries that are really leading the way. I mean, the US has really been, I think, kind of the first mover in this area. It was the US who really stood up the first space traffic coordination service about a little more than 15 years ago at this point. So the US has for a very long time been tracking objects in space and sharing information on where those objects are and helping satellite operators avoid collisions. The US also has a very well developed regulatory framework for governing space activities at the domestic level to apply some of those international norms and standards. I will say, though, that the Europeans are catching up and probably could even surpass the US in the next couple of years in terms of their commitment to space sustainability as well. The European Union also has its own space surveillance and tracking system. That's what it's called, EUSST. And it essentially serves the same function, but for European satellite operators to help them understand where they are and avoid collisions. Europe is also considering much more robust space sustainability regulations in its, its various domestic frameworks for how space activities are regulated within various EU countries. And so we may actually, even this year, there's a new law that's expected to come out within the EU that could actually set even more strict space sustainability standards than it exists in any country to date.
Could you talk about the specifics of some of those standards? Like, what are the things that we're doing to lead to more sustainable use of space?
Yeah, a couple, really at the end of the day, a lot of these are just common sense things. I mean, I mentioned already the space debris mitigation guidelines of, essentially, so for example, when you when you think about how a satellite is launched, so it goes up on a rocket, right? And it's usually attached to the rocket with a few like key bolts, so that it doesn't like shake around when it's launching. But when it gets deployed in orbit, like those bolts essentially are released. They call them explosive bolts. I mean, it's not like a big explosion or anything, but they essentially break apart so that the satellite can break free. Well, guess what? That break apart little pieces of bolts have suddenly now become space debris. And there are different ways you can design your satellite to minimize those impacts. Excuse me. So that's an example of a space debris guideline. More generally, looking at the space sustainability guidelines, um, I'm so sorry.
No worries at all.
My apologies. So when we look at some of the space sustainability guidelines that go beyond the debris mitigation, some great examples are just like every few hours, you should screen your satellite for potential collisions with other satellites. I mean, it's really as basic as that, right? So you should have an understanding of where your satellite is, which is really a foundational practice for any satellite operator. And you should use that knowledge in conjunction with the knowledge that governments and private companies are able to provide in terms of where other satellites are, and use that to assess the risks of collisions with other objects, and then take steps to actually like mitigate those risks, whether that's doing a maneuver to move your satellite into a slightly different orbit to avoid the collision, or communicating with the other operator to work out a mutually agreeable solution. And that's kind of the third point I would make in terms of like common sense best practice standards. Those communication protocols, I mean, it sounds really basic, but in fact, like we don't have today a universal like phone book or directory of, hey, this satellite belongs to this person. And if you have an issue with it, you need to call this phone number. Even something as basic as just sharing that kind of contact information with other satellite operators is a space sustainability best practice, because otherwise, how could you possibly coordinate a response to a potential collision?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Uh, Audrey, let's sort of talk a little bit about the role of private companies, especially when we talk about sort of SpaceLink or Amazon and the mega constellations like Starlink or OneWeb. What role do they play in this area? And I should also say, to give Audrey maybe just a minute, she's had a lot of speaking engagements, so it can get a little wearing on your voice, but also we do have a Q&A box. So if you think of any questions as you're listening to Audrey speak, please drop those in. We'd be really happy to take questions from the audience.
Thanks, Kat. I appreciate the extra second or two. So yeah, so your question is an excellent one, Kat, in terms of the role of the private sector, because I think, most people are who watch space recognize that It's not really governments who are driving space activity anymore. I mean, certainly at the beginning of the space age, it was all about government space activities. But in the last 20 or 30 years, access to space has become increasingly democratized and privatized.
Mm.
The growth in space activities is due right now to private space activities like SpaceX, for example. Um, so two answers to your question. The first is that, I mentioned that outer space treaty at the very beginning, which actually does require states, so governments, to supervise their national actors. So it's not like these private companies are kind of running around like stateless, doing these activities. I mean, they are governed by regulations within their home countries. But putting that even aside for a second, those satellite operators, those companies, in some ways have the most experience operating satellites because of just the sheer numbers of satellites that they now have under their control. There's no government that has a mega constellation the size of the Starlink constellation. So in some ways, SpaceX has the most operational experience to really bring to bear to these international conversations about space sustainability. And while SpaceX as a private company, isn't setting the global norms and isn't working, with other governments to, agree on standards, companies like that have a really important voice in those discussions. Because the last thing that we want to do is create standards for space sustainability that aren't grounded in, technical best practices. And
Mm.
so we need that input from industry in order to ensure that what we're doing is actually sound from a technical perspective.
That's a really important point, Andre. And I want to come back to something that you just said that you talked about the responsibility of state actors to um, regulate or control the activities of their national actors. So the responsibility of governments to control what their companies, whether they're government owned or private, are doing. We've, as I alluded to, we've had a lot of engagement this week. And one thing that was very interesting, I think, that would be germane to this conversation is you talked about what happens if um, a state fails in its responsibility, or if states offer actors sort of a way to come to them and go around the responsibilities.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really is a risk, sort of this notion of flags of convenience. And unfortunately, at the present, I mean, there really aren't enforcement mechanisms internationally for any of these space rules, partially because many of the ones I mentioned, are voluntary, but also because, the Outer Space Treaty, which we talked about, just doesn't have those mechanisms built in place. I mean, it was negotiated at a time during the Cold War where, again, it was sort of at high level principles. It was, seen as sufficient amongst those countries who negotiated it. And they didn't really want to have those enforcement mechanisms.
Mhm.
So, I think one area where we've tried to address this is really through capacity building and kind of encouraging all countries who have space activities to create those domestic regulations that are in compliance with those international laws. There's actually a United Nations body. It's called the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. It meets in Vienna, and it deals with all of these matters related to, it's not just space sustainability, but space exploration, asteroids, coming to Earth, anything having to do with space. And one of the areas that they worked on probably about 10 years ago at this point was exactly that, was asking countries to provide summaries of their national laws and regulations related to space to serve as examples for other countries to follow so that they too could create those systems for their national activities. And I think that was actually quite a successful project because, of course, one state can't force another to create a law or create a policy, but what they can do is provide a template or some useful experience to help guide other states in their similar endeavors.
And that's happened here in Australia. I know that some of US space law has influenced the law that comes in here, as well as commercial space laws that govern other areas, such as in Japan. So, what I would like to talk about now is actually we have a really great question. I might answer this question because I think it sort of falls along this from James. And he asked, have collisions increased, or is it mostly the risk of collision that has increased? And also asks, are we seeing reduced lifespan of satellites due to collisions?
Hmm. Yeah, great question, James. So we have not seen an increase in collisions because we have put some of these practices in place. So in 2009, there was a catastrophic collision between a US satellite and a Russian satellite. And it was quite a shock, I would say, to the space community. I mean, I was working in the Pentagon at the time, and I will never forget how it really shook everyone to think that this could happen, sort of so easily. And it was really in that moment that the United States began to provide those, the data and the collision screenings that I talked about earlier. And because the US stood up, 15, 16 years ago now, and started to provide that data, we haven't had another catastrophic collision, but it's because we put those things in place. Now, to your other point, part of the question, yeah, I mean, the risks to collision are going up because just the population is going up. And so therefore it's just becoming more crowded. But we have at least put the baseline pieces in place to allow for satellites to continue operating safely. And so therefore, I mean, to the last part of your question, we're not seeing reduced lifespans of satellites due to collision, although we are seeing from time to time, kind of like spontaneous breakups of satellites or um, uh, malfunctioning of satellites that we don't know for sure if it was because it got hit by like a small,
Mm,
untrackable piece of space debris, but that is certainly one possibility. But it's not like a widespread thing that we see all the time, but from time to time we do see something and we think, one reason that could have happened is because it got hit by like a really small piece of debris. And actually, if I could, Kat, I mean, just on this point, because I think it's an important one to talk about. Um, space debris, we kind of group in like three different categories. Um, Space debris that's larger than 10 centimeters, so like the size of a softball, is generally able to be tracked from the ground-based systems that we have today, like the ones that my company orbits, or excuse me, operates. So if a piece of space debris is sort of large enough, we can track it and we can predict its orbit, and therefore we can warn satellite operators like, hey, there's this piece of space debris that you're on a collision course with, like you need to move your satellite out of the way. So those pieces of debris were sort of, I hate to say we're able to manage them, but like it's a manageable problem. Then you have pieces of debris that are less than 1 centimeter. So these are really tiny pieces of debris. Those pieces of debris are not able to be tracked. They're too small given the current technology, but they're also small enough that they're not likely to cause a catastrophic failure. Now
yeah.
it's possible if they hit like the exact right spot, like it's that they could, but it's unlikely. And then we have this third category, this 1 centimeter to 10 centimeters. So these are the objects, maybe think the size of a battery or something like that, that they are generally too small to track, but they are definitely big enough to cause a serious incident with a satellite if it gets hit. And those we call lethal, untrackable, or non-trackable debris. And that's, I think, really where some of the risks that you're alluding to come into play. And that's why, there are significant efforts going on to really reduce the size of objects that we're able to track so that we can get all the way down to being able to track essentially anything that could threaten a satellite.
You've spoke a little earlier, Audrey, about sort of how there's no enforcement mechanisms in the Outer Space Treaty. It can be really difficult, but there are efforts in order to sort of provide frameworks where you have agreements and bilateral agreements. And I'm thinking specifically of the space sustainability practices within the Artemis Accords.
Mhm.
I wonder if you might just comment about the way that countries can work together in order to And you've said a bit about it, but that there are specific agreements that countries are entering into in order to agree that this is an area where they will work towards.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I mentioned the United Nations, and that's kind of like the pinnacle of international collaboration because it involves, any state who's a member state of the UN, which is almost every nation on the planet. That's kind of, if I could, like a gold standard of international multilateral norms and standards is if you have something that's agreed at the UN. But having lived through a number of different UN negotiation processes, I can attest that those um, negotiations, they take a very long time. They're very difficult because you really do have to build consensus amongst, over 100 sometimes nation states. And so those processes aren't necessarily the most responsive ones to address emerging challenges. And so what we've started to see in the past couple of years are kind of like what I think are called like mini lateral frameworks, where you have a couple of countries who are like-minded, who have said, we want to just get this process started. And we don't want, we want to go through the UN. We want to get that gold standard, but we think we can't, we need to move more quickly, or we want to sort of build momentum amongst a group of like-minded nations first before we take something to the United Nations. And so you mentioned the Artemis Accords, which were, a US-led initiative, but that now have, I think, over 50 signatories, which are a framework for responsible space exploration, including around the moon, on the lunar surface, and in what's called cislunar space, which is the area between the Earth and the moon. And it lays out some guidelines and norms for how we conduct our operations safely and responsibly on the moon, which are certainly going to be needed as more and more countries are looking to explore the lunar surface. There are also technical bodies that are either government or non-governmental in nature that allow for some of the coordination on space sustainability as well. And in fact, the best example of that is an organization called the Interagency Debris Coordination Committee, or the IADC, which is a technical body made up of representatives of a number of different space agencies around the world. So think NASA, the Australian Space Agency, China has a space agency, the Russian Space Agency, Roscosmos. They all get together and they develop technical standards for space debris mitigation. They also do tracking of objects as they re-enter to improve our detection and our analysis of those kinds of events. So there's a lot of different ways that either countries or key agencies within countries are working across international boundaries to address space sustainability.
It's excellent. I think a good overview because I think not everyone is aware of these types of agreements that exist because, you know, a lot of people don't think about how everyday life, how space touches their everyday life. So we had a question that came in through about satellite operators, whether they would be required to have better solutions to orbit determination before they're allowed to launch. So I thought it might be useful to talk about how orbits are selected and sort of use that question as a way to talk about how we put objects in space, where we put them, and you talked a little bit about polar orbits, but it would be a good opportunity.
Yeah, sure. I absolutely can talk about that. And then I'll get to the specifics of the orbit determination question as well, because I think that's really good. So when you think about where satellites go into space, I mean, the sort of the basic primer is there's three different kind of general orbital regimes, and I'm really oversimplifying here, but I think it's good for just to get started. So there's low Earth orbit, which is just a couple hundred miles above the Earth's surface, and these are satellites that are going down around the Earth in about every 90 minutes. And so these are satellites. A great example of something you'd want in a low Earth orbit is what's called remote sensing or Earth observation. These are satellites that are really taking pictures or other sensing of the Earth. So, for example, some weather satellites are also in low Earth orbit as well. And if you think about taking pictures, the closer you are, the less you got to zoom your lens, right? Just the basic analogy. So that's one reason you want to have your satellites in low Earth orbit. Second, you have medium Earth orbit. Actually, that's not particularly, it's not used all that much, so I'm going to skip over it. And then there's geosynchronous orbit, which is what I mentioned before, 22,000 miles above the Earth's surface. And essentially, what that is it's at the exact right distance above the Earth, so that as the satellite orbits around the Earth, it is looking at the same part of the Earth. It rotates at the exact same speed as the entire Earth, so that it stays what effectively stationary over a single point on the Earth's surface. Historically, one of the most useful applications for geosynchronous orbit was actually communications. Because essentially your satellite antenna was fixed, then all you had to do from the ground was, you knew where exactly you needed to point it, you pointed it up, and then the signal got sent back down. There are other applications, but essentially you have, different orbits are more useful for different things. Although with technology development, we are seeing new, these same orbits used in unique ways. So it's actually not as generalizable as it used to be. But in any case, that's the idea, is that certain applications are better suited for certain orbits. And so therefore, certain, like that geostationary belt that I mentioned, that's a particular distance above the Earth's surface. And so there's only so many of those slots around the Earth. And so you can imagine that competition for those kinds of resources essentially can exist. Now, when an object gets launched, into orbit, if it's in geostationary orbit, it's sort of more or less fixed, and there are slight variations, but it more or less stays, kind of in the same place, at least relative to the Earth's surface. Now you compare that to low Earth orbit, where something is going around, every 90 minutes. And in low Earth orbit, you also have some impact from like atmospheric drag. I mean, it's
Mm.
obviously much less than like in an airplane, but those impacts are still there. And so, when you think about, so this question about orbit determination is really about understanding where your satellite is going to be in the future. And let me try and give you an analogy. If you're driving in your car and you're going straight and you're going down the highway and you take your hands off the wheels, but you've set your car going straight, um, in 50 meters, you might have a pretty good idea of where your car is going to be. In 100 meters, yeah, probably a kilometer or a mile down the road, your car is almost certainly, unless your wheels are perfect, your car is almost certainly going to have veered a little bit off of that
Mm.
path. And the same exact thing is true in space. And so when we think about orbit determination, this is kind of a technical term for, I know my satellite is here right now. How well can I predict where it's going to be 6 hours from now, 12 hours from now, 24 hours from now? And the
Mm.
reality is, it's actually kind of a challenging problem, because even if you understand the physics really well, these perturbations in the atmosphere, these small amounts of drag, actually do affect where you are. And so this is why this continual monitoring of where satellites are is so important, because you can't just say, well, I know where it is now, and therefore I will know where it's going to be in 24 hours. So the question is sort of like, are we going to have to improve those things in order to launch? I don't think so, just because I don't think that that's necessarily the direction that the policies are going. But I do think you're onto something when you ask about, like, do we have to improve our understanding and our analysis predictions of orbits so that we can do better collision of, assessment and avoidance. And really, that's where some of the ground-based tracking systems come into play, as well as satellites actually having to, like, for example, self-report where they are to
Mm.
improve our knowledge.
And I think while we're sort of in the Leo orbit conversation, we did have a question come in about sort of Kessler effect. What happens if it gets too congested, or there's too many collisions, or what are we doing about that?
Yeah. So there's something that's called the Kessler effect, and it's basically a theory that says if you have too many pieces of space debris, it will cause like a cascading failure, essentially, of space debris. That
Mm.
that this debris will be there'll be so much debris that satellites can no longer avoid, being hit, and then those satellites, they'll get hit by a piece of debris. They will then, explode and create more debris. And then that debris will then hit other satellites and it'll be kind of this exponentially cascading failure. That's a theory, of how debris could become, sort of a cascading problem that we really couldn't come back from. We're not at that point yet, and I'm not sure that there's even international consensus on, how much debris would be needed in order to get to that point. But it is something that the space industry is very mindful of, because if we get to this, sort of tipping point where suddenly we have cascading collisions that we can't recover from, I mean, then we will have rendered space unusable, not just for us, but for the future.
Yeah, and that's certainly a worry. Let's talk about something that is probably maybe a little adjacent to this, but it's a nexus of space sustainability and national security. What happens when we intentionally create debris in orbit through something like an ASAT anti-satellite test?
Yeah, that's a bad day for space, cat, is what that is. So yeah, and just to like kind of make sure we're all like just to level set, right? So an anti-satellite missile, you just think of it as a missile that essentially, instead of being sort of pointed out, is essentially pointed up and is targeted at a satellite and like sort of directly hits it and causes it to explode. That is a form of a weapon for destroying a satellite. And there were really two very visible examples of anti-satellite missile tests. One was in 2007, where the Chinese deliberately destroyed a defunct Chinese weather satellite, creating thousands of pieces of debris, almost all of which is still on orbit today. And then the second example was in November of 2021, when the Russians did essentially the same thing, although they did do it at a lower altitude. And so a lot of the pieces have come back, but nonetheless, it was still an incredibly irresponsible act in both cases. So that's a bad day, right? I mean, we just spent the last 30 minutes or so talking about how satellite operators can do all these responsible things of, reducing debris and avoiding collisions and all that. But if you got folks who are like purposefully destroying satellites and creating orbital debris, I mean, those events can be like one of those events can, essentially create like 10 or 20 years worth of debris that's created through normal operations. So we really, really don't want those kinds of destructive acts to occur.
Mhm.
So one of the things I was very proud to work on when I was in government was an initiative to ban the testing of debris generating missiles. And the Biden administration came out with a voluntary, unilateral commitment that said we will not conduct destructive direct ascent anti-satellite missile tests, and we invite all responsible spacefaring nations to make similar commitments. And I think I don't have the numbers at my fingertips, but 30 or 40 countries voluntarily made similar commitments. And then there was a resolution at the United Nations that also encouraged countries to make such commitments. And that resolution, I believe, had over 100 votes, which is really very significant in terms of showing the general support by countries for these kinds of measures.
It's excellent. Just while we sort of mentioned Russia, the last question that we had submitted prior to the webinar was asking about resurrecting communications with Russia in terms of space studies development. I'm not sure exactly what they're going through, but I think there's a good question there about how are especially with the US, how are the US and Russia cooperating in space? Is there cooperation in space?
Yeah, so, ever since Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, the US has really pulled back almost all of its space cooperation and other forms of cooperation with Russia. Now, there is one place where we do still operate in space with the Russians, and that's the International Space Station. The ISS has been in orbit since the 90s. It's in its, third decade now. And the US cannot operate the International Space Station without Russia, and Russia cannot operate the International Space Station without the US. And so we do continue to cooperate on the ISS. I think, though, looking into the future, the prospects for cooperation in space, to some extent, I think will just be a reflection of broader geopolitics. In that way, I actually don't think that space is special. I think that we will partner with nations in space to the extent that it's aligned with our broader geopolitical interests. And so I think whether or not there's a future for US-Russia space cooperation really depends on whether there's a future for US-Russia cooperation in general.
That's I think, a very clear-eyed assessment of what's happening in space right now. And again, I just want to take a moment. Oh, we've got a question, another question. That's fantastic. To encourage anyone that has questions to please ask them. So I've got a question here from Keith. Do China and Russia notify their space objects, or does the US, EU have to find and track them?
Yeah, unfortunately, there is not great sharing of information from Russia and China about their space activities. So in general, yes, the US and the EU and others are having to track those objects and essentially do the collision analysis in the absence of sort of receiving any information directly from the operators in Russia and China. This is a big problem, actually, because it's one thing if you have, just a handful of satellites and sort of you're not sharing that information. But as China in particular starts to launch its own large constellations, they have plans for something that's essentially a Chinese version of the Starlink communications constellation. As they start launching thousands of satellites in orbit as well, it's really incumbent upon them, I think, to share information on where their satellites are in the same way that a lot of operators, Western operators, share now. We're starting to see a little bit more engagement on this point, but candidly, we're just not seeing as much as we ought to, or we need to, in order to keep space safe.
So along that line, it would be interesting, and I know that you've touched on this, Audrey, throughout this conversation, but maybe to sort of put a pin in it, what are the immediate risks that you see facing space sustainability, but also perhaps what are the more middle and far term risks?
hmm Yeah, I think the most immediate risk is that there's some catastrophic incident that we just all wake up to one morning, whether that's a collision between two satellites who didn't heed, the warnings or who were operating with bad information, or there was like a breakup of a satellite that got hit by a piece of space debris. The most worrisome scenario, in fact, is that you have two dead objects, large objects, like two old satellites that can't maneuver anymore. They're on a collision course with one another. Because if that happens, there's literally nothing you can do to stop it. So that's kind of like the nightmare scenario in the near term. I think that's what, would keep most space debris scientists up at night. When I think more about the long-term kind of systemic risks, what worries me the most is that we won't create this international system of norms and standards and cooperation and data sharing and enforcement to manage space traffic in the long term. Because while, we can't, like I said, we can't do anything if two dead objects hit each other. What we can do is set up the system better so that we don't have as many dead objects going forward, so that alive objects don't accidentally collide with one another, and we do everything we possibly can to just like increase collaboration, increase transparency, and increase communication among those who are operating in space so that it becomes a safer and more predictable environment for everyone.
Yeah. And I think that with the national security implications, this is something that governments are certainly working on, as you alluded to through the entire conversation about how much, we're working on getting these standards through the UN and other mechanisms. What are private companies themselves doing to sort of mitigate those risks or to improve perhaps the landscape of space sustainability?
Yeah. Yeah. So, private companies are very incentivized to improve space sustainability. I mean, because they depend on a predictable operating environment for the health of their fleets. And so in some ways, they are one of the most important stakeholders in this discussion. And so what we've seen, as it's become difficult for governments to have these kinds of conversations. And the reality is, the more strained the overall geopolitical environment becomes, the harder it is to reach consensus on any issue, let alone space. Um, the private sector, in some ways, have tried to step in and fill some of those gaps. Now, again, they're not doing it on behalf of their governments, and what they do doesn't have like the UN gold standard on it.
Mhm.
But there have been initiatives by private companies to work with one another to agree amongst themselves anyway on what those practices, those safe operating practices are, and to really publish those. So there's a great document that was put out actually by an American nonprofit. It's called the American Institute for Aeronautics and Astronautics, AIAA. They worked very closely with several large satellite operators, SpaceX, OneWeb, Iridium, in order to put together a set of industry best practices. And, those are widely available. They're published online. And I think there really are, kind of informally shaping those global standards, even if it's just kind of a coalition of the willing at this point.
Mm. And we have another question from James. So thanks so much, James, for asking excellent questions. For important satellites, has there been a move towards adding more maneuverability capabilities?
Yeah, that's a great question. And absolutely, the short answer to your question is yes. The longer answer to your question is that, these debris mitigation guidelines that I've kind of touched on several points throughout our discussion have standards in them about essentially deorbiting your satellite at the end of its useful life. So, either putting it into an orbit such that it will decay naturally in a short period of time, or having thrusters on board that can allow you to essentially force it to come back down. Those kinds of rules have actually been put in place for quite some time now. And there is discussion about, okay, so if we want people to have that ability to do that controlled reentry, those same thrusters can do your day-to-day maneuverability. And so absolutely, there is a growing sort of chorus of voices that think that it is important to actually require satellites of a certain size or whose lifespans would be a certain length to have maneuverability capability, exactly for what I think you're implying in the question, both to avoid the collisions as they're operating, but also to allow them to have that deorbit capability at the end of their life.
I think and we've talked about this, that private companies are really doing some interesting things, especially when it comes to um, innovative ways that they're hoping to address space debris. A lot of those are in their infancy right now, and they're not at the testable stage. But what are some of those things that these companies are thinking about that have the flexibility to do that perhaps the state government can't do?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one great example that comes to mind is, can satellite operators, like American satellite operators or European satellite operators, work directly with their Chinese counterparts on safe operations and of sharing that information? I think I'd be hard pressed to say that the US government and the Chinese government are going to get together on this topic, although they absolutely should, because it's a very important topic. But if the geopolitical environment has, say, other issues that might be more pressing at the moment, then the private sector can do some of this engagement, I think, directly. It doesn't necessarily require the government to intervene. Totally different example, actually, to just give you sort of a very different one. There's a Japanese company that recently launched a satellite that was like made entirely out of wood, or like almost entirely out of wood, which, makes it much easier to burn up entirely when it comes back into Earth, which means you have less risk of like a piece surviving to hit the ground anywhere. And so that's, I mean, I don't think it was exactly kind of what you're asking in the question, but I do think it's kind of an interesting example of industry doing something innovative on the technology front to like address a space sustainability challenge that may have not ever been contemplated by a government.
Yeah, and there's also the name escapes me unfortunately, but there's companies looking at, can they collect space debris and then use that for in-space manufacturing as well? So because as we know within the industry, it's quite expensive to get things to space and to launch things. So if as we move into using space more and more um in space, can we use what we've left to actually be more sustainable?
You're exactly right, Kat. There's a whole new kind of sector of the space industry that's emerging now. It's called in-space assembly and manufacturing, and it's getting after exactly what you're talking about. Like, how do we reuse components? And or I mean that's I think a little further afield, but the what's coming I think right now is the idea of servicing, like directly servicing another satellite, like adding more fuel to it to increase its lifespan, moving it to a different orbit, either to also increase its lifespan or just to kind of move it out of the way. And you're absolutely right. This is where industry is leading the way. In some cases, with funding and support from government. I mean, that certainly has happened. Japan is actually a leading actor in this regard of funding these space sustainability missions, these debris removal missions. And it's a Japanese company that's doing a lot of it, but it's actually with the support of the Japanese government. So, in fact, the question you asked earlier about which countries are leading the way, I should have included Japan in that example because in that answer, because they've been a great example of leading on space sustainability as well.
I think space in general is a great example of how public-private partnerships can really yield very excellent results that move towards the more sustainable future that we're all hoping for.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Audrey, we're coming up at the end, just a couple minutes left here, and I wanted to just leave you time to any final thoughts you might have in regard to this, or even action steps to leave our viewers with that they can do in their own work.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Kat, I'd almost like to just finish where I started, which is with a reminder that the reason that we care about space sustainability is because of the ways we benefit from space here on Earth. And I'm not going to go through, the litany of ways again, but I do want to just remind people of that because, we're not doing space for space's sake. We're doing space for our sake here on Earth. And so I guess if I had to give an action item, a piece of homework to the audience, I would say, in as you go about your day today, identify one new way in which you're using space, which you might never have thought of before.
That's an excellent thing. And we've had just one very late last question, which I think is interesting. So I might actually just give us a chance to answer that because a comment from Keith saying it's a very timely webinar with Gilmore's launch window opening tomorrow and asked, do launch operators now have greater risk for safe launch and ascent to orbit in LEO?
Yeah, it's a good question, and the short answer is yes to that as well. So when you think about a launch vehicle going up, you want to time it such that you don't hit anything that's already in orbit, right? And so there's a process that they do where they screen different launch windows to essentially advise launch operators, hey, you can launch in this 5 minutes or these 10 minutes or this 20 minutes. And if you do it in that window, you're not going to hit anything on the way up. Well, guess what? With more and more satellites, those windows are becoming smaller and smaller and smaller. And it's going to become increasingly difficult to have safe launch windows. So yeah, that is definitely an emerging issue that we've got to get our arms around.
Thank you so much. Well, everyone who's been listening, especially those of you who contributed to the conversation, thank you so much for joining us. A very, very big thank you to Audrey for giving her time, coming all the way to visit us in Australia and share her deep expertise in this matter. And again, if you have any questions about the programs that we offer at the United States Study Center, I encourage you to visit our website at ussc.edu.au. Thank you.
Thank you, Kat. Thank you all for joining us today.